let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that we'll probably jump into, we can do a little bit of it right now, but the sample problems that I gave you a chance to, with the sample solutions and that sort of thing, I wanted to sort of see if you had any questions on any of those. Now, granted, there's some of that material we have not covered yet, and in that event, then we'll kind of defer those questions until we sort of get there. But I wanted to just see if in general, there it is. Okay, so of that list of, I guess, 20 questions, were there any of them, based upon the information we've kind of gone over so far, that you had questions about? Okay, all right, then we will go ahead and jump on into the material for today.
Wait, the last one, can we go over the one where we had, because I didn't bring that particular list with me, but I know that I have one question. It was the one where you had multiple values and you were entering it into the calculator. So you had like this year was 5,000.
Okay, we're going to be doing a lot of those today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, today is pretty much all about internal rate of return. So, hopefully you had a chance to kind of read through the quick little sort of mini chapter on internal rate of return. Not a whole lot there, so we're going to kind of delve into it a little bit deeper and work through a bunch of different sample problems, take some questions, and kind of make sure that you're comfortable with this. One of the reasons why we're spending so much time on sort of internal rate of return is probably one of the most important calculations you're going to do as it relates to real estate investments, okay? And the whole idea, what?
I'm sorry, do I have a question on number 3? I was trying to figure out what my question was. I seem to have a hard time differentiating between when I'm supposed to use the 12-month, like the 12 month or the month.
Okay.
So like on the third crop, on the third one, I guess where it's like to use 12. I mean, I get.
So okay, here's what you have to do. Now, at the very beginning of all of this, one of the things you're going to notice is in a lot of the problems, I will explicitly state this is monthly or this is annual. And I kind of do that for a little while, and then that's where I take off the training wheels, okay? Once the training wheels are sort of taken off, then you have to kind of read through the problem and you have to sort of say, okay, are we talking about monthly payments? Are we talking about annual payments? And that has to kind of come from the way in which the problem is worded. And so, like if it says, okay, you're getting, you know, annual payments, or you're making monthly payments, or you're receiving, you know, that's going to be the trigger to know it's going to be monthly or annual or potentially something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, like I said, at the very beginning, I kind of try to ease you into it, but then over time, you kind of got to begin to sort of pick up on those sort of cues within the language.
Okay. And then like sorry, the same problem, like, for the month, and the calculation that you put here, or the calculator function,
Yep.
You did 60 and N.
Correct.
And I came with the 60. And look on the button here, it's like X.
Yeah, what it does, what it's doing whenever you put in, like, you put in 5 shift in essence, what it's basically saying is it's taking and multiplying that 5 years times 12 months or 12 periods per year to give you 60. So you have a choice whenever you enter the problem of entering it as 60 in or 5 shift in, either one. Okay, it's in essence doing the same thing. It's just, once again, it's just once you get more comfortable with it, you're going to just, you're going to find it almost interchangeable as to what you're going to do. I have a tendency, whenever I work through the problems, is that almost in all cases, I'm going to be probably choosing to do the 5 shift in, unless there is some other weird, compelling situation that would require me to put it in as like 60 in. And when we kind of get to that point, you'll sort of see what I'm saying. Okay? Okay?
That's exactly what I was going to say, is it's confusing as to when to use shift in or just straight up in.
Yeah, see, here's the thing. It's not going to make any difference at all if it's annual. In other words, if one payment per year, then, like for example, if we were to put it, if it was one payment per year, and you were to put in 5 shift in or you were to simply put in 5 in, the end result is going to be the same, because all it's doing, whenever you hit the shift, is it's saying, okay, that's going to be 5 times 1 payment per year, which is going to be 5. But if it's set on 12 payments per year, what's happening whenever you hit that 5 shift in, it's taking it and it's multiplying it by 12 to get 60. And then if you just simply put in 5 in, that would mean only 5 months. Okay? Yeah. It's not inherently tricky. It's just more of you've got to start thinking in terms of whether something is going to be annual or something is going to be monthly. Okay? And once you can kind of just begin to think of things in that way, and actually that's one of the things that we're going to be dealing with today, is actually looking at cash flows that are going to be monthly, cash flows that are going to be annual, and kind of how you deal with that. Okay? All right? Other questions? Okay. Let us move forward. Okay. So, as I mentioned, today is all about internal rate of return. Pretty much, as I said, kind of the most important set of calculations that you're going to do are going to revolve around the internal rate of return, because internal rate of return, for the most part, is trying to convey on an annualized basis what the performance of this particular investment is, okay? But there are some interesting little nuances and some interesting little sort of different ways that you kind of need to sort of address it and deal with it. And we're going to kind of go through, you know, a variety of different examples, and then we'll do a little quiz and so forth, okay? But while we're going through this, please, you know, once again, feel welcome to answer or ask any questions, and I'll do what I can to answer. All right. So, first thing that we probably want to do is just start with a couple of examples. Now, we've already, keep in mind, we've already worked through, you know, 1 or 2 last week, but we're going to kind of repeat and expand on what we did last week. So let's assume that we've got a property. How much do we pay for it? You give me a dollar amount.
$2 million.
How much?
$2 million.
$2 million, okay? So we bought the property for $2 million, all right? How long are we gonna hold it? How many years or months?
7.
6 years, okay, 6.5, all right? 6.5 years, okay, that's the purchase. All right, what are we gonna sell it for at the end of that 6.5 years, or what do we expect to sell it for?
10.
Oh, come on, that's a ridiculous price appreciation. Come on, give me something realistic.
2.8.
4.5.
What?
4.5.
That's still a little high, but okay, fine. Whatever, you guys are the supreme optimist. All right, so, our reversion, all right. And what about our operating cash flows? Okay, so once again, that's the purchase price, that's the sale, that's the term or the holding period. What about the annual cash flows that we're going to receive on this property while we own it?
225,000.
Okay, 225,000 are going to be our annual operating cash flows. Okay, so this is a good place to start with just doing a basic sort of internal rate of return. Now, we can do this multiple ways, all right? Given that the cash flows, or the annual operating cash flows are constant, we can actually just use the top row of the calculator in terms of present value, future value, payments, and term to calculate our internal rate of return, okay? Yep.
Is that a negative or a positive?
Which?
The cash flow.
The cash flows are going to be positive in this case. So that's going to be a positive, that's going to be a positive, that's going to be a negative. Okay? So, the simplest way to solve this problem is going to be, all right, 1 payment per year. $2 million as a negative present value. Okay, so change the sign. Then we can put in 6.5 years as our term. And here, we can put it in either as 6.5 shift in or just 6.5 in, either way, because it's one payment per year, all right? Then put in 4.5 million as our future value or our reversion. And then put in 225,000 as our payment. And then we're going to simply solve for the interest rate, or in this case, the rate of return. Okay? Now, let's do that. See what we get. Okay, what we get?
21.74%.
That is correct. Okay, everybody good with that? Yes, no, possibly could be. Okay. Now, while we've sort of got that, and you know, I'm not going to ask you to do this on today's quiz, but you could potentially see this in the future at some point when we kind of begin to tinker around with this that much more. So let's just say, in this particular problem, our desire is to get a 25% rate of return. Okay? If our desire is to get a 25% rate of return, this investment doesn't meet it, correct? Okay? But what we could do is we could put in 25 as our interest rate, and then we could solve for any of the other variables. Now, before you do anything, let's just kind of walk through this. If we were to basically solve for the present value, what that would tell us is we're going to have to pay less for this investment up front in order to achieve that 25% rate of return. Does that make sense conceptually? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, now say we keep that the way it is for a moment, but instead we want to solve for the term. Okay, so what's probably going to happen in terms of the term is we would probably have to hold the investment potentially longer in order to achieve maybe that return, or shorter, depending on, well, once again, let's just, well, we can do it. What the heck? Let's just see what happens. All right, let's just solve for n just for a second. Actually, a shorter holding period. Okay, that would make sense because obviously the impact of the resale price. So in other words, what we're saying is that if we wanted to achieve a 25% rate of return, if we held this investment instead of 6.5 years, we only held it for 5.3 years, we would end up achieving that 25% rate of return. Does that make sense conceptually?
So, like,
Yep.
the reason it bumps up is because the idea of like $1 today is worth more than
Yep.
$1 tomorrow.
And
If
so
you
that,
got that,
that
a
4.5
year ago.
million becomes that
Gotcha.
much more impactful.
Gotcha.
Okay?
Understood.
All right. Now, let's just go ahead and put it back, put this back to 6.5 as our N. All right. And now, let's say that we want to solve for, as we were talking about earlier, just the present value. So you have 1,744,008,740. So what that's saying is, whoops, that with a 6.5 year term, wanting to get 25% with a $225,000 a year payment and an expected selling price of 4.5 million, then what we're left with solving for is the present value. So it's basically saying that if we wanted to get that 25% rate of return, we should only be paying 1.7 million instead of 2 million. Does that make sense? Okay. What I'm trying to illustrate here is just how, that once again, You can change one variable in order to get kind of to what you want to sort of achieve, if you will, okay? Now, if I go back in and we put in the 2 million again, 2 million as our negative present value, and now maybe we say, all right, for that, once again, 25% rate of return that we want to get, what would our payment maybe have to adjust to?
$308,000.
Okay, so instead of getting $225,000 a year for 6.5 years, we would need to get $308,573 for that 6.5 years in order to, once again, get that 25% rate of return. Okay, because all we're doing, if you really just sort of think about it, we've got the term, we've got the present value, we've got the payment, and we've got the future value, and we've got the interest rate. So we've got these 5 variables. Okay? And so the reality of this is what we're sort of saying is we're wanting to get a 25% rate of return so we can change any one of those 4, okay, and then see what the resulting impact is on basically the remaining 3. Does that make sense?
So if you change any of them, it's just automatically going to change the rest after you've already put it in the equation.
It's gonna basically all it's gonna do, it's gonna replace the 1 and then see what the impact is on everything else. Okay? Because that's all you're doing is you're just basically resolving, but you're now wanting, in this case, to sort of hold constant this 25% rate of return. Okay? So this is useful in a variety of ways because, as you can see, which of these potentially can you control? Okay? Well, you can potentially control how long you own it in the sense of, you know, when you put it up for sale. Okay? Now, you may not sell it immediately upon putting it up for sale, but to a certain extent, if holding the asset long term deflates your rate of return, then you might want to sell it quicker rather than later. Does that make sense? Especially if the operating income is not sufficient to give you the rate of return that you want to achieve. In other words, here's my point. If your operating income is really low, but yet the sale price or the reversion is really high, you want to sell pretty much as quickly as possible. Okay? But if you've got really high operating income relative to the reversion, then it may actually benefit you to own the property much longer term. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's the kind of analysis that you sort of need to kind of begin to think about whenever you're sort of playing around with this kind of internal rate of return. Now, once again, you may not know, I mean, obviously as an investor, what you are really going to be able to sell it for. You can try to predict, what it's going to sell for, 3, 4, 5, 10 years into the future. But, you don't know with 100% certainty unless you've got some locked-in contract price, in some sort of distant, future, okay? But the point is, you need to be able to kind of make those simple little manipulations to see what the outcome would be, okay? Make sense? Okay.
So on the calculator, until you hit clear, it's keeping
Correct.
each
Everything is in there, yes.
of the top row.
That is, yeah, that's what we talked about last week. That literally, you can turn the calculator off, set it aside for a month, come back to it, unless you've cleared it, that information from that problem is still in there.
And you have to go shift clear too.
The only way you get rid of it is to hit the shift clear. And then that clears out all those registers so that you can start fresh. Now, what I did here, obviously this is the first part of the problem, okay? And then from that point forward, it was just a matter of substituting one thing, solving for another. Substituting one thing, solving for another, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, cool.
It's just interesting. So like, other than you just is this based on not being able to get as much for the property when you resell it? Because normally, you know, people say like, you know, buy and hold, and then you know you'll make more money. But in this case, I guess that doesn't make too much sense. Is that because of external factors?
It could be, because here's the thing that we don't know with 100% certainty what that reversion is really going to be. We can predict what it's going to be based on what we think the income is going to be off of the property at some future date, and we can, you know, make the assumption that people are rational, reasonable, all that sort of stuff, and the interest rates don't dramatically change up or down. So a lot of this is still guesswork, okay? There's no question about that. I mean, the way I like to sort of explain it is, think about yourself as if you were sort of like an investment in one sense. How many of you honestly feel like that you could fairly accurately predict what your total income is going to be 10 years from now?
Billion.
Okay, there we go, $1 billion, all right. But how many of you think you can probably predict what your income is going to be next week or next month? You have a much greater, obviously, likelihood of being able to predict that, or maybe a year from now, or, you know, whatever, okay? But, you know, whenever you start getting out 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, 10 years into the future, it becomes really difficult. Well, the same sort of thing is true with real estate. You know, we try to model it in such a way that we try to take into consideration what all of the different variables are and what value we perceive or we think that those are going to be at any given point in the future, and then try to model it out in some sort of a very ironclad lease with our tenants that, you know, here are going to be the stair steps of cost, here's going to be the reimbursements, here's going to be, you know, the property taxes and so forth, so on. But, you know, what happens if all of a sudden, you know, state law changes and property taxes go from, let's say, 2 or 3% of value per year to all of a sudden 6 or 7% of value per year? Okay, well, all of a sudden, what kind of impact is that going to have on real estate? It's going to devalue, at least based upon, you know, current levels of income relative to expenses. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So is it up to the investor to decide if the dollar today is more valuable, or how much more valuable than it is to hold? Or is that like a standard metric?
Here's the way that I would tend to look at it. You know, if you have strong, stable cash flow now, in terms of the leases are giving you a great rate of return that you can live with, okay, that you're happy with, then there's really no reason to sell it. Unless you could get a massive, you know, capital gain on that property right here and right now that outweighs, once again, what those annual rates of return are. And it's a judgment call. There's not an absolute answer. I mean, yes, you can model it out and say, okay, well, here's the answer, you know, but in a lot of cases, there is a fair amount of judgment, because just because we say it's going to be worth, you know, whatever it was, $4 million, yeah, $4.5 million, 6.5 years from now, what if it's not? What if it's only worth $3 million? You know, how is that going to change everything? It's going to put even that much more of a heavy reliance on whatever the operating income is. Okay, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, other questions somewhere? Nope, okay, let's move forward. All right, so are you starting to get the sense for this is not about just pushing buttons on the calculator? You're starting to hopefully understand that this is, you've got to kind of think through some of the logic associated with what some of these numbers represent. Okay, let's move forward. Let's do kind of a monthly situation. All right, so in this case, 12 payments per year. All right, now, let's say that we've got a property, and, well, first of all, give me a dollar amount that we want to pay for it.
You should clear all.
I will.
Okay.
Here. Just for you, I will clear
Just
all.
to get in the habit, like.
Yes, okay. All right. So what dollar amount do we want to spend on this property up front?
2.5.
Is that what we spent the last one? No, we spent 2, okay. All right, we're upping the game a little bit. All right, so 2.5 million is what we're gonna spend on it. So that's gonna be our cash outflow. All right, now, let's say that with the operating income, we'll throw a teeny little twist in here, all right? So if you remember, you know, we've got potential gross income, we subtract out vacancies and collection losses, we add in other income, gives us effective gross income, subtract out total operating expenses, that gives us net operating income, subtract out annual debt service, that gives us before tax cash flow. Okay, now what we have done pretty much up to this point is get you down to the net operating income number. Okay, we're going to kind of stay for a little while. But let's just say on this particular property, all right, we've got monthly income of what? Give me a dollar amount. Monthly income.
100.
Like off of rents, just purely rents.
100,000.
How much?
64,000.
64,000 a month.
Oh.
That's a bit much. Relative to, that's probably more than the, let's just see, 64,000 times 12, $768,000 a year. That's probably a bit high. All right, so
15,000.
25,000.
Yeah, we'll go with 15. What the heck? All right, so 15,000 is a month. All right, annual over here, just to kind of, we're going to be putting everything in as monthly, but I want to kind of do the annual calculation only so that we can kind of show side by side what's going on. So 15,000 times 12, an annual of 180. Okay? Make sense? Okay, vacancy and collection losses, let's just say we don't have any, so zeros, no other income, all right? So that means our effective gross income is 15,000 or 180 per year, all right? Now then, for operating expenses, what percentage of our EGI do we want our operating expenses to be?
15%.
15%. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of put out here to the side. 15% of EGI. So we're going to take that 15,000 times 0.15. So that's going to give us 2250 as our total operating expenses times 12.
And we made the 15% number.
All right. Everybody good with that? Okay, so that gives us net operating income of 12,750 or 153,000 per year. Okay, everybody good? All right, now at this point we're not going to mess with the annual debt service or before tax cash flow for this particular problem. All right, so what number are we going to be using over here for our payment or our cash flow? 12,750. Okay, that number right there. Okay, that is our net operating income after we have subtracted out our operating expenses. So 12,750, that's going to be a positive number, positive income to us, okay? All right, now, how many months or how many years are we going to own this?
5.
5 years. So we could put in 60 in 5 years times 12 months. So we could put in 60 in, or we could put 5 shift in, either way, okay? Everybody good with that? Yes or no? Okay. Now, at the end of all of this, after 5 years, what do we anticipate selling it for? Now, we don't. Now, I know the eternal optimist in here always want to sell something for more than what we paid for it, but what if we don't? What if we sell it for maybe something a little bit less than what we originally bought it for? Okay, let's just see what the impact is. So let's just say that we sell it, I don't know, for $2,250,000. So we lose basically $250,000 off of the resale. So that's going to be our future value. And once again, we can go in and just simply use the interest rate function key to solve for our internal rate of return.
So we don't need to use the IRR.
Not yet. We're slowly. The next problem is we will. Okay.
So, but that still would justify.
The only reason why we don't have to use the internal rate of return function is because our payment amount is constant.
Right. So we don't have to make like the cash flow year by year.
Once this number becomes variable, we absolutely must use.
So that's still considered an internal rate of
It
return.
is.
Gotcha.
It is. Okay? That's why we're doing this, because people in their minds think, oh, if we don't use the internal rate of return function on the calculator, then it's not an internal rate of return. That's not true. It's simply that for most internal rate of return problems, they typically have variable cash flows. Therefore, you are forced to use the internal rate of return function.
Gotcha.
And a variable cash flow is only when it's like negative.
Well, no, it's not even negative. It can be positive or negative, but it just is different from 1 year or 1 month to the next. Like in reality, like think about it like this once again, like your own personal income. Chances are the income that you've had for the past 5 years as a person probably has gone maybe up or down or all up or all down or whatever. But the point being is it's not the same every single year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand that. But what I mean is,
But that's why you have to use the internal rate of return, because then it isolates each individual cash flow for each year. So you have cash flow for year 1 or month 1, cash flow for month 2, year 2, so forth, so on. Whereas this makes the assumption.
because we're only looking for the lender's yield or the buyer's yield.
Well, you're looking for the internal rate of return. Okay, that's a whole different thing. Lender's yield, and we'll get into that later. Okay. So this is making the assumption that once again the cash flow is constant over the holding period. Okay. All right. So we do all of that. Let's see what we get.
So, just one quick question. So really the only time we would use that internal rate of return is again, if we have a different set of, like the cash flows are variable, so that it's not gonna be 12,000. The reason we're not using it is because it's 12,750 every month.
Right. All right. So I ended up with what, 6.103? Yes. Yep, hold on, we do it one more time.
Yeah, 4.32.
People were talking to me whenever I was trying to do the calculation. So
Excuse me.
let's try it again. Right. Present value, 12,750, payments, 60 yen, 22.5, future value. Okay, 4.32? All right. So 4.32% would be our internal rate of return in that particular calculation. Now, once again, kind of like the previous one, if we were to say, well, we really want to get maybe a 6% rate of return, how much would that mean that we would have to maybe sell the property for to replace basically that value? Okay, so let's just see. 2,482,557.49. Does that make sense? So once again, the answer, well, to the original problem was the 4.32, but what I'm saying is, if we're not happy with 4.32, and what we really desire is a 6% rate of return, what would we have to sell it for at the end of that year 5? We'd sell for basically 2.482, which is still less than what we had originally paid for it. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes, no, possibly could be. All right? Okay. Let's move forward.
Can you lower that just a little bit? Please? Thanks.
President,
Yep.
can I borrow a calculator?
Can you borrow a calculator?
Yeah.
Yes, you may.
Hey Brian, you got is there more than
You
one?
got a second one for Justin over there?
What is, what you guys, geez, come on. Oh, killing me.
But then you have like
Dude,
20
bring
of
all
them.
these calculators to class.
Use the app.
I know. Lord.
What's the rent payment on a calculator, Lee?
$10 per class.
Thank you, man.
That would be a nice little rental game. Payback period, yeah, 3 class periods or 2.5 class periods. Okay, everybody got that? Let's move forward. All right, so this next one, yeah, I said I want to do variable cash flows. All right, and so let's make this one annual. Okay, once again, how much do we want to buy it for?
7.75.
Okay, 7,750,000. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, so that's our purchase. Okay, and what do we ultimately want to sell it for? You guys are just so
good at it?
Okay. Sale price. Okay, and how many years do we want to hold it?
6.5.
Well, let's try to go with a whole number.
10.
Okay, 10. Why not just, okay, 10 years.
That'd be realistic.
All right,
That's
so
a
here we
decent
go.
return, though. That makes
Now,
sense.
with this one, we've got to use the cash flows. And because you chose 10 years, we've got to write 10 years worth of cash flows.
Let's change that.
So,
You played
all right, so here's what we're going to have. You're going to have 7,750,000. That is going to be a negative, and that's going to be your first cash flow. Okay, once again, we used that key last week, the cash flow sub J key, which is on the calculator. It is third row, third column. You see CF sub J. All right, so that's telling us that at time period 0, that's how much we're spending. All right, now.
So that's not a present value anymore.
I'm sorry?
That's not a.
That's not present value. Because now we're forced to use the cash flow function because our cash flows are not going to be the same for those 10 years. All right? They're going to be variable. So we can go ahead and start. We're going to have 10 different cash flows. All because of Brian.
No. I said the purchase price. 10 years was amazing.
Okay, all right. 10 years. All right. So let's just give us our cash flows. So give me the dollar value of the cash flows.
We're going up and down.
Starting with year 1.
50,000.
50,000. Okay. What about for year 2?
60,000.
Okay. Year 3.
54.
Okay. Year 4.
5.
Hold on. Are we serious? Can we just do years 1 through 3, 50,000?
We're serious
4
right
and
now.
5.
We're here.
I mean, like,
Okay. All right. So next year,
80,000.
8. 80,000.
I think that's for the next 3 years.
Okay. So 80,000 is going to be, let's say, for the next 4 years. All right. We'll make it for a total of 5 years. How's that?
Yeah. Very
Okay.
stable.
Then, in year 10, what is going to be our final operating cash flow?
10 million.
90,000. Okay, so 90,000, but then also in year 10, we're going to have the reversion, which will be the $10 million sale. So don't forget that.
And we just start at 0, right? We start at.
CF1, CF0 is 0.
So we started, yeah, C of 0 with the 7.75. Okay, now what you're going to do is you're going to enter 50,000 cash flow, 60,000 cash flow, 54,000 cash flow, 55,000 cash flow. Then this is where a shortcut comes in handy. That $80,000, how many years total is it happening? 5. So what we can do is we can put in 5 right after that, shift N sub J. And the N sub J key is really right below the CFJ key, okay? Third row, third column over on the calculator, N sub J. What that's saying is that that cash flow, that singular cash flow, is occurring 5 consecutive times. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
Wait, so we put 80,000 in,
Yep.
and then we just click second key, CFJ key.
No, we hit 5. 5 times.
Oh, let's see. So you already clicked 80,000 CFJ.
Yep, 80,000 CFJ, and then it occurs for 5 consecutive periods. So we put in 5, shift in sub J,
Gotcha.
not just in, but in sub J underneath the cash flow key. And then that tells the calculator that 80,000 occurs 5 consecutive times.
We don't have to technically.
Okay? Or you can just key in 80,000 5 more times, or 4 more times. Okay? All right. Then the final cash flow is going to be
10,090,000.
correct. 10 million. Well, yeah. Hold on. Where's my eraser sheet?
It must be nice.
Okay. So the final cash flow is going to be 90,000 plus 10 million equal cash flow sub J. Then to solve for internal rate of return, you're going to hit shift and then the IRR per year, and then you get the answer.
So if I just did that, and when I put in the 10,090,000, it still said CF6, is that problematic? Like, shouldn't it say CF10?
As long as you put in everything as written, it'll be fine.
So I get no.
The IRR year is just, it's just.
If you got no solution, the chances are you did not put this in as a negative number, you put it in as a positive number.
When you have.
Because if you put it in as a positive number, the calculator is basically saying, you're receiving that money, and you're receiving all of this money, so it's impossible to calculate a rate of return because it's infinite. It's like money falling from the sky. There's no way to calculate a rate of return because you've invested nothing.
Okay,
Okay?
okay.
Makes sense.
All right, so let's do this real quick.
3.7.
What did you say?
I got 3.38.
Yeah, I got 3.38. Well, I guess 3.39 if you're not.
I still got a lot to type in. Though.
Yeah, 4. You're wrong, Andrew.
Probably.
I think it said CF6.
Right here, too.
Yeah, I don't know if it's right or not.
I don't know if it worked. I'd like to do that shortcut.
3.3873%. If you didn't get that, basically you just put something in wrong. Simple as that.
Simple as that.
It's not that simple, I wish.
And what's your decimal seconds on your calculator?
9.
So,
Go negative on the 7 million, so.
Yes.
Yes.
Is this what you do the answer? Easy. That's why I miss all those questions. Because I was clicking this, I was clicking that. Chase is available.
Why would I get anybody else?
Yo, where's IR? Oh my God.
It's third column.
Yo, Cole,
Second
at that
row.
Starbucks,
And it's
bro?
the second. You have to go like shift that.
It's wild that I saw you there.
Huh?
It's wild.
Where are you seeing it?
Saw it on Starbucks and
It's adorable.
saw it on
He was doing like a,
Can you
like I went up to him, to say what's up, and then like, when I was like 5 steps in, everyone at the table saw me. I like realized he was at like a seller appointment, and I was like, and the seller was like shaking my hand, and I was like,
Yeah, that was that guy, bro. We're getting a 30K reduction.
Really?
Yeah. His name's Karinsky. He's so funny, bro. Such a character.
He was a good dude. Like he like shook my hand. He didn't know who the fuck I was. I was like, why are you shaking my hand?
So because that's how. Because now you know him.
Now you know him, Karinsky. Now you know the guy. I did the deal with. That's hilarious, bro. That's hilarious. Cool. What were you doing there, man?
Just to sort of show you in Excel real quick, kind of the same
I just wanted to
thing.
stop and like do some work on my computer.
All right, which obviously I know you guys are going to get more of this than you can handle in San Miguel's class. How's that going, by the way?
Ha!
Good. Okay, so in San Miguel's class, and you know, you're going to obviously, if you haven't already, you know, start to do a lot of these calculations, but you're just going to do them in Excel as opposed to using the calculator. So in Excel, all you're really going to be doing is you're going to put that initial cash flow as the negative. You're going to put in all the subsequent cash flows. You're going to add, obviously, your final operating cash flow with the overall reversion. And then once you've done all of that, then the internal rate of return function in Excel is really simple. All you do is pretty much equal internal rate of return, open parentheses, and then just select that basically set of values, close the parentheses, and you're done. Okay?
And we're using the calculator. Why?
Because you need to understand the logic behind what you're doing as opposed to just simply, you know, plugging the numbers into Excel.
And this is assuming we bought it cash.
This is assuming cash. Okay? Now, okay, you had a question about?
What was the shortcut for the N sub j again? So you entered 80,000.
Correct. That 80,000 occurs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times.
Right.
So what you're doing is you're saying, instead of me having to type that 80,000 5 different times, what you're able to do is say, okay, that 80,000, we're going to have it happen 5 times, done.
Okay. So the keystrokes though are like.
It's just 5 shift and then the N sub j, which is right below the CFJ. If you look on the calculator, you see a little N sub j. That's simply saying it happens that many times.
Oh, I see what's going on. Okay, now I get it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Yes, no, possibly could be.
Yeah.
All right, good. All right. Moving forward. So on the quiz, that should give you like, what, 30, 40 years to have to put in?
If you make one typo, you're done.
Right, you're toast. Okay.
The internal rate of return on a mistake is going to be so high.
All right, let's just do another relatively simple one. Okay, so 1 payment per year.
I got my hair done.
And in this case, let's say, once again, what's our initial purchase price? Give me a purchase price, come on.
11.5.
Thank you. 11.5 million, I'm assuming. 4 billion. 4,000. All right, so purchase price 11.5 billion. All right. And how many years are we going to hold it?
3.
3 years.
PTSD from 10 years.
Okay, 3-year holding period. And what are we going to sell it for?
12.5.
12.5. And what are our annual operating cash flows?
75?
75,000? $75,000 a year.
Oh.
That's all we're going to get. Okay, fine.
A year. This is a year, not monthly. What is this, a 0.01%?
Well, it's going to be low or lower.
You two are
Once again, Brian loves giving weird numbers. Okay, all right.
Let's just throw a 1 in front of that 7.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna go with this. All right, so 11.5 million. This is just, once again, we've already done one like this, but I'm just kind of reinforcing. 1.5 million. Oops, that's gonna be present value. Actually, no, let me back up. Let's do it this way. I know there was a reason why I wanted to do it this way. All right, so even though this is a constant payment amount, constant cash flow, I want you to enter this one as a cash flow as opposed to using present value, okay? Just to show that you can do it a different way, okay? So we can enter it as cash flow, then put in 75,000 as our puny operating expense, our operating cash flow. All right, now we can also use the shortcut because that occurs, what, 3 times?
You really want to do that?
Well, I'm sorry?
Like, aren't you going to add the 12.5 million to the third year?
You don't have to. Well, hopefully you are. Yeah, okay, my bad. You caught me before I had a chance to think through it. Okay, so let's just go ahead and put it in as 75,000 as the second cash flow. And then put in 75,000 plus the 12,500,000 as our final cash flow. Then solve for internal rate of return. All right? And the thing that Chase pointed out that I obviously wasn't thinking about at that moment was that with the cash flow, the difference is you have to make that adjustment in that final year cash flow. But if you do it using the present value, future value, that sort of thing, it automatically does it for you. Okay? Does that make sense? Doesn't make sense. Okay. So what's happening? Okay, so here at time period 0, we're spending 11,500,000, and then we are receiving 75,000, 75,000, and 75,000. Okay, but then we're also going to be receiving the 12,500,000 as a reversion. Okay, now, whenever we put this in as a cash flow, since we're putting these in individually as a period cash flow, so this is period 1, this is period 2, this is period 3, we've got to combine all income for that final year into one singular value for the cash flow, okay? But whenever you do it with the present value, future value, what it's basically saying is we're putting this 75,000 in 3 times, and then we're putting the 12,500 in at the end of 3 years as a separate sort of function, but the end result is it is actually adding them together. It's just that you're not having to do it. Does that make sense? Okay? It's just the setup is a little bit different, okay? Because you have to think through, once again, the logic. Okay. So once we've done all of that, what do we end up with as our rate of return on this?
3.45.
Is there a reason you would do either or?
Well, okay. What I tend to do is, if the cash flow is constant, I pretty much always am just going to use the present value, future value, solve for the interest rate. But if you've got, once again, the variable cash flows occurring, then you're going to want to use the cash flow function. In this particular problem, I wanted to use the cash flow function because we've already worked one where we just use the present value, future value, but I want to show you still can do it this way, it's just set up a little bit differently.
And you could use the shortcut,
Well, yeah, the shortcut doesn't really do a whole lot for you here because you really would be putting 75,000 and then you're going to say, okay, that's going to happen basically twice, those 2 times, then you're still going to have to put this in, okay? The shortcut really comes into play, once again, when you've got like 3, 4, 5, numbers that are the same in a row over and over again. What you're going to see, and actually where you're going to see it used the most in this class, when we get into the brain damaged stuff. When we start getting into adjustable and variable rate mortgages, and you have payments that are constantly changing from one month to the next, and then having to basically deal with that. And that's where the logic begins to really be pretty much, the brains explode. Okay. All right. And appropriately, that happens next Saturday, so right after Halloween. Okay, moving forward. All right, let's take a look at this one. 11.5 million cash flow, 75,000 cash flow, 75,000 cash flow, and 75,000 plus. Rules, cash flow. 3.45. Okay. All right. We good? It's good old nice warm fuzzy feelings? Okay. All right. Let's move forward. All right. So one of the things that we have spent a little bit of time doing, after we do this problem, we're going to take a little break. You need to pretty much commit this little sort of operating income kind of formula to memory. Even though I've pretty much been giving it to you, you still need to kind of commit it to memory. So potential gross income minus vacancies and collection losses plus other income gives us effective gross income, subtract out total operating expenses, gives us net operating income, subtract out annual debt service, gives us before tax cash flow. Okay? Now, once again, we're going to be sort of getting down to the point of before tax cash flow. All right, so let's start off, once again, give me a property, and let's say we're doing an apartment community and we've got, 100 units. Okay, what's our monthly rental rate? 1,200 to 800, so the blend would be what, 1,000? Okay, $1,000 a month. All right, so let's get our annual income off of this property. So it's going to be basically 100 units, well, just wait, we've already got it there, we're inventing it, times $1,000 a month times 12 months to give us $1,200,000 as our potential gross income. Okay? Make sense, everybody? Yes or no? All right. So 1.2 million. Just write that down so everybody understands that's where it came from. All right. Annual DGI. Okay. All right. So for this one, what sort of vacancy and collection losses we want to have? What percent? 5%, okay? $60,000 a year. Okay? And then what other income do we want to have on an annual basis? Other income can be derived, once again, for this kind of property. Parking fees.
8,000.
8,000, 12,000. Anybody else? We're doing everything per year, so let's just say per year. Okay, I heard 8,000, I heard 12,000, so let's go with 12,000. What the heck? All right, so 12,000. All right, so let's do the math.
$1,208,000. Oh, that makes sense.
minus 60,000 plus 12,000, 1,152,000. Okay? Everybody get that?
Yeah.
Okay, all we're doing is taking 1.2 million, subtracting out the vacancy and collection losses of 60,000, adding in the other income off of ancillary services, whatever those are, to get our effective gross income now of 1.152 million. Okay? Yes? Okay. Now then, operating expenses. We're going to make the operating expenses as a percent of the EGI. So what percent do we want to make it? 30. 30. Okay, 30% of the EGI are going to be our operating expenses. So that's going to be 345,600. Okay, we'll subtract that out. That leaves us with net operating income of 806,400. Okay. Okay, so far so good. Okay, now we get to enter the new round. Okay. Debt service coverage ratio. Okay. This is probably one, if not the most important little ratios that you're going to calculate whenever it comes to basically looking at what your loan possibilities are for commercial property. Something called the debt service coverage ratio. Now what the ratio is, it is equal to the property's annual net operating income over the property's annual debt service. Okay? Now, in this particular case, we only have one of these three variables. The one variable that we do have, that we've calculated, is the net operating income of 806,400. We don't have the debt service coverage ratio, and we don't have the annual debt service. Okay, so let's talk about what this actually means and what it does. All right, assume that you're a lender. What is your almost only primary concern whenever you lend out money? Getting it back. Okay, simple as that. Okay, and with hopefully the rate of return that you obviously anticipated that you were going to get. Once again, also hoping people don't default, so you don't have to go through foreclosure. You hope that you don't really have to get embroiled in any sort of other issues, but the primary concern is you get paid back as the lender. All right, well, to help ensure that you get paid back, you want to make certain that whatever property that you are loaning against is generating sufficient income to stand on its own. In other words, you don't want to have to worry about, the credit rating of whoever the borrower is for a commercial property. Okay, we're not talking about residential, we're not talking about owner-occupied houses. We are talking about commercial properties. Commercial properties need to stand on their own 2 feet as it relates to their financial performance. And so what the lender is basically going to say is, all right, give me kind of this operating sort of income information, and then based on that, I am willing to accept that these numbers are reasonably accurate, but I also, as the lender, don't want to take any risk or want to minimize my risk. So instead of allowing you to make your annual debt service payment, in other words, your annual mortgage payment, in other words, you're actually going to have monthly mortgage payments, but ultimately if you multiply the monthly payments times 12, you get your annual debt service. Okay, so the most money this property would have available to be able to make those mortgage payments would be what? 806 worth 400, yes?
Yep.
But the lender is saying, no, we're not going to allow your payments to be that full amount, because what could happen? Maybe you don't get as much rent as you think you're going to get. Maybe your vacancies and collection losses are a lot worse than you think they're going to be. Maybe your operating income is non-existent. Maybe you've got all kinds of crazy unexpected expenses that hit. The lender doesn't want to have to worry about that. So the lender is going to take a haircut, if you will, sort of off of whatever this income is, and say, we are going to say that we feel really comfortable with this particular loan, or we maybe don't feel so comfortable with this loan. All right? Well, if they feel really comfortable with it, the haircut might only be a 10% cut. Okay? And so what that means is your debt service coverage ratio would be 1.1. Okay? Well, let's just use that number and then calculate what our annual debt service would be based on that. Okay? So what that means no, not 1%, 10%. Okay. So with that 10% cushion, what they have basically said, all right, with a 1.1 debt service coverage ratio for this particular property, that means that we will give you a loan whereby the total cumulative payments for 1 year would be a maximum of $733,000, meaning that we've got a 73% or basically 10% cushion as the lender to make certain that if any of these numbers are not accurate, that we've got this number to basically pull from, or you do as the borrower, to be able to make sure that you make your payments. Does that make sense, yes or no? Because think of it like this. If they had a 1.0 debt service coverage ratio, what that would mean is it would be the same amount. Meaning, there's a $0 cushion for the lender in the event that something goes wrong. Does that make sense? So the lender's not going to lend you enough to basically to be, where you only have you don't have any cushion. You have a zero cushion. Now, as I said, kind of the best case scenario that you're probably ever going to see from a lender is this 1.1. And that's whenever you've got an absolute premium property, premium borrower, premium market, everything could not be better in the world, okay? Now, reality is probably going to be closer to 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, okay? Well, 1.3, 1.4, that's basically saying they want a 30 or 40% cushion because they really believe the market is not as strong as what maybe you're leading them on to believe, or there's going to be upheaval in the market, or this particular product type maybe has some real issues and problems with it. And so as that number escalates, that's going to make a big difference in what they're going to ultimately be willing to lend you. So let's just say that we make it a 1.3. All right?
How are you changing percentages to ratios?
All you're doing is just taking the 806,400 mathematically, dividing by the debt service coverage ratio, and that's going to give you your annual debt service.
Okay.
Wouldn't you just take 90%?
It's not the way
You can, but it's not going to work out perfectly.
I got a different number, and I don't.
It's not going to work out because trust me, this is the way to do it. I know what you're thinking, but it's not the same. Okay? Because 90% of the NOI is not the same as simply saying we want basically 10% more than your annual debt service.
So we're not multiplying the percentage, we're dividing it.
We're dividing, all you're doing is you're taking this numerator and dividing it by, basically in this case, the debt service coverage ratio, which gives you your annual debt service. Okay? In other words, I mean, okay, maybe I'm being too presumptuous, but annual debt service is simply going to be equal to NOI over debt service coverage ratio. Okay? Just as much as NOI, oops, sorry. NOI is going to be debt service coverage ratio times annual debt service.
But my problem is, how do we get from like 10% to 1.1? That's what I was asking. Like,
Okay.
are we doing it in our head?
No.
No.
What we're saying is 1.1 is they want to ensure that you've got 10% above and beyond what is needed for repayment.
Okay.
They want you to have 30% beyond what is needed for repayment.
So if it was 3%, it would be 1.03.
Yeah, but they're never going to give you a 1 point. They're never going to. The lowest you would ever get would be a 1.1. Okay.
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 All right. Okay. Any questions up to this point? Okay. Now, so let's just say that it was 1.3. All right. So what would that make our annual debt service? Be $620,307.69. Okay. So if we go back over here. Right, and we put in 620,307.69 as our annual debt service. We subtract that from the 806,400. We end up with 186,092.31. Okay, make sense? Now, okay.
So they're basically saying they want you to put more money down.
Not more money down, it's you're getting to use less of your operating income toward making your mortgage payment.
Yeah, it's property specific.
If you look at it, it's like how much money you get to keep. That's the way I used to look at it.
Well, it's not so much how much you get to keep, it's okay. Once again, this is all of this is from the lender's perspective, okay? The lender is just trying to protect themselves. Okay, and they're saying under no circumstances are we going to allow you to have mortgage payments that are going to be too close to the amount of income that you're actually generating.
So as an investor, you want to lower because like
yes, well, as an investor, in a perfect scenario, yeah, you would much prefer to have a 1.1.
But then your free cash flow is so little.
But your free cash flow is going to be little. Okay, but the lender is. In addition to trying to protect themselves, in one sense, they could be doing you a little bit of a favor by saying, okay, you're going to be less stressed out to actually make your payments because even if your income does dip, you're still going to have plenty of excess to be able to make your payments. Okay? Now, the next step is where I think this will potentially completely gel. All right.
Before tax cash flow?
That's before tax cash flow. All right. So with our annual debt service of the $620,307.69, as we said, that is annual. Okay. So let's make that monthly. Divide by 12. Okay. And so you get $51,692.31 per month that you could spend on your monthly mortgage payment. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, from the lender's perspective. Okay.
So if you gave them more than that, they would say no?
No,
Like, I
that's
think
not,
that's
no,
just
no, no, no,
strange.
no, okay. That's not what this is about. This is about on the front end, how much they are willing to allow you to have as it relates to the overall loan, okay? Hold with me for about 3 more minutes and this will all make sense, okay?
Consider me help.
All right, so if that is your monthly, your maximum, this is your maximum monthly payment, okay? So what the lender is telling you whenever we want to make you this loan. So here's what's going to happen.
So you only can use
Just hang with me for a second here. All right, so 12 payments per year. Clear everything out. Then we're going to put in the $51,692.31 as a payment. Okay? Now, how many years are we going to basically amortize this loan over? What, 20 years? Let's say? 20 years. All right. So 20, shift in, or basically it would be what, 240 months? Yes? Okay. So 20 years. Now, what about the interest rate on this loan? 5%? Okay, 5% interest rate. Then we're going to solve for present value or the loan amount, which this would be our maximum loan amount based on the debt service coverage ratio equal to 1.3 and so forth, so on. Okay, so let's just see what we get. Okay, so it's telling us our maximum loan amount is going to be $7,832,693.46. Okay, you get that? Yes. Okay. Now, what that means, this is hopefully what will begin to kind of put everything together. You're kind of working backwards to a certain extent. You're saying, okay, the property is generating this amount of money on an annual basis, okay? And the lender is saying, based upon that, you can afford, off of this property's income, to basically spend this amount per month as your monthly payment. And if the lender has on offer 20-year loans at a 5% interest rate, then this is the maximum loan that you're going to get from that lender. Now, everything is subject to potentially change or negotiation. So what if you walk down the street to another lender and everything else is identical except they're willing to give you a 4% interest rate instead of the 5%. So 4%, resolve the present value, 8,530,361.05. So now, if we were able to get a lower interest rate from a competing lender, everything else being the same, that means that we could borrow basically about what, $500,000 or $700,000 more. Property hasn't changed. Conditions with the debt service coverage ratio haven't changed. Term of the loan has not changed. All that changed was the interest rate. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. So, going back, what would happen? This is, once again, before we do the calculation, let's just think about this logically. What would happen if instead of a 1.3 debt coverage ratio, they actually were willing to accept maybe a 1.1? That is going to increase the amount that we're going to have available for annual debt service, which is going to increase the amount we have for a monthly payment, which is then going to ultimately translate into a
Larger loan.
larger loan. Okay? Does that make sense? Here's another way to flip this around, and maybe it helps that much more. On the residential side of things, it's basically a similar sort of mindset. It's just done just a little bit different. On the residential sort of thing, if you're buying a personal single-family residence for your own owner occupancy and that sort of thing, the lender will say, okay, what's your gross income? Okay, maximum, gross income, and they'll say, okay, we will lend maybe up to like 30% of that. Okay, and then they'll say, well, but if you have to subtract away from that all of your other debt in terms of student loans, car payments, credit card debt, yada, 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 then we're down to this number, and maybe, based on that number, the adjusted number, maybe we'll lend you a little bit more than 30% of that number. Maybe we'll lend you 35 or 40% of that number. Does that make sense? So it's a question of kind of what they're really sort of looking for in that circumstance. It's very much the same sort of thing. What is your ability to pay? Okay? And that's all this is really trying to do, but instead of looking at personal income, that's irrelevant for commercial property. What matters on the commercial property is how the property will do. We could care less that you've had 10 bankruptcies and, whatever. That's irrelevant as long as the property is a stable property and operating, extremely well. Now, we may be a little bit concerned about, bankruptcies and foreclosures only from the standpoint of, okay, maybe they didn't do a good job, but what were the reasons for those? Was it a market change? And what was the end result of those things? How much did the bank end up losing? And then they make those judgment calls as to whether they're going to, lend to that person again. But in many instances, it's almost irrelevant what the personal circumstance, especially if you're lending to a corporation, okay? Because it's then based on the corporate entity and the viability of that corporate entity, and not really anything to do with the people behind the deal. Okay, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, any questions?
Can you scroll down a little bit?
So basically you're saying is that, what you're saying is we're at the 30%, 30% is saying that they only use only 70% of the income of the property.
Correct.
Right. And then
Or debt service.
Towards that service, then we put it in the calculator to figure out what would be the monthly income for the 20-year. So basically you're saying that that's what helps us qualify what's our buying power.
Yes, that's basically this illustrates what your purchasing power is for that particular property.
So I guess the next step is to figure out what the purchasing power is.
Well, it's what we're basically doing. I mean, in this sense, if this is our maximum loan amount, then you can back away from that and say, well, then what's our maximum purchase price? Well, what's that going to be dependent on? It's going to be dependent on the loan-to-value ratio. Okay, so what if the lender has a standard loan-to-value ratio of, I don't know, 80%. Oops, not 80% loan-to-value. So that means that whatever dollar amount here that we got for the loan, we would simply take the $7 million, let's say $832,693.46 divided by 0.8, and that would give us our basically maximum purchase price. The maximum purchase price would be $9,790,866.83. Okay, does that make sense? With a loan-to-value ratio of 80%. Because the lender, the commercial lender, has two primary criteria whenever they're doling out commercial real estate loans. One is the debt service coverage ratio, and the other is the loan-to-value ratio. And pretty much everything hinges on that. Now, what we've done is we've worked backwards into what is the maximum purchase price for the property. So what if, for this particular property, the property were priced in the market at, let's say, $11 million. Could we do this deal? No. What if in the market this property were priced at, let's say, $9 million? Could we do this deal?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, so we can also flip it around the other direction. Let's just go ahead and kind of do that here for a second.
Would it be wrong to look at the DCR as the percent of the cash flow, and it's kind of like a roundabout to my last question, but the percent of the cash flow that they're requiring, free cash flow that they're requiring to cover the debt. You can look at it that way? Okay. So like 1.5 would be 50% of your free cash flow would go to them.
In essence, yes.
But it's not like they're putting it in an account for you.
No.
They're taking it out of the.
No, this is just, it's
the amount of the loan, right?
It's just making sure, now they may still have a reserve requirement, which we talked a little bit about last week, where that of that free cash flow, like for example, this dollar amount here, oops, yeah, what was it? 186, what?
192.
92, okay. There we go. All right. So your question was, well, okay, they make you set aside that money into an account and that sort of thing. Okay, you remember from our discussion last week, one of the things that we talked about was the lender may have a reserve requirement or reserve replacement requirement. So that, like, for example, if you need to replace a roof, you need to replace, carpet, you need to replace air conditioning, all that sort of stuff, that you've got money left over to do so. So what they might say is, okay, yeah, this is the amount that we obviously are using for your actual mortgage payment, but in addition to that, we might also say you must set aside either a specified dollar amount each year or a specified percentage of the overall property's income for a reserve for replacement, where they do sequester that money into basically a savings account for use for any types of improvements or repairs or maintenance that may need to be done on the property that go beyond the normal month-to-month kind of things. Does that answer your question, or get at what you were talking about?
Yeah, but in this case, the 1.3 is used to figure that amount, but then.
But this is just for the mortgage payment piece, okay? The free and clear cash flow on a before-tax basis still could be in some way set aside or sequestered, or in other words, taken possession of by the lender and put into an account for future potential issues that may arise that need to be paid for. Because at the end of the day, it's like we were sort of talking about last week on the residential side, it's a lot like them sequestering money for your property taxes and your insurance, okay? So in addition to that, there may be other things that they may choose to, but every lender is different. Some lenders are saying, look, you know what you're doing, I trust you, you're gonna have the money to pay your property taxes and your insurance and take care of all the maintenance and repairs. I don't wanna have to be bothered with that as the lender, to keep that money in a reserve account, and then every time you need it, you gotta come to me and get my approval to spend it and that sort of thing. But then other lenders are like, no, I don't trust you. I want to make sure that every single dollar, is basically sequestered, and so every significant expenditure has got to receive my approval as the lender. And once again, every lender is different. Just like, as I said last week, they're all like retailers. Okay, you have Walmart that has one price, you have Costco that has another price, you have Amazon that has another price, you have, and they may be relatively close to each other in price, but in some cases they may be, dramatically apart from each other. And the same sort of thing is true with lenders in terms of what they have on special this week versus last week, or what property type they particularly are more apt to give you a better deal on.
So if this property went into foreclosure, would the bank have that money to
Yes.
make the, okay. Not
If they hold back the reserve, then that money then would be available to satisfy part of that debt, yeah. Okay, other questions?
The reserve is above and beyond that.
Yes,
1.3.
yes. Now, right. One of the biggest problems, and I mentioned this last week, that a lot of borrowers have, especially on the residential side, they overcommit themselves, okay? And they don't have that extra money to be able to do the things that they need to do to keep the property in good working order. And they defer maintenance, okay? That's a term you hear all the time, about properties. Oh, how much deferred maintenance is there? And that can be on the residential side, that can be on the commercial side. That, you have a property owner that says, you know what, I really need to replace the roof. I've got several leaks in the property. It's damaging, part of the roof and it's coming through, it's leaking, but I'm just gonna put a tarp up there and and cover over it and wait another year or two before I replace that, and then potentially more damage gets done and creates more deferred maintenance, and it just gets kind of worse and worse and worse. Well, part of what the lender is trying to do is that they do require you to set aside that extra reserve for replacement. Then it's perfectly legitimate for you to be able to go in and say, lender, hey, I need a new roof. Okay, can I use part of my money out of my reserve requirements to put on my new roof? And they say, yeah, of course you can, because we want to keep the property in good working order. Okay, make sense? Yeah. All right. All right, other questions on this? Okay, now we're going to go the flip side. All right, and go just the opposite. I told you there was going to be a break after this, but I didn't tell you how long of a problem this would be before that break actually occurred. Okay, all right, so let's say that we kind of set $10 million as our maximum sort of price point for property that we're looking for in the market. We're just flipping the model here. And so if that's the case, this is the maximum price that we want to pay. All right? And so we kind of work forward and we say, okay, well, the lender is telling us they're willing to loan up to an 80% loan-to-value ratio. So that means, based upon just that one variable, they're willing to lend us $8 million on this property. Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay. So that would be our maximum loan amount. Okay. Then, based upon that, we know the interest rate. Let's say the interest rate on the loan is 5%. Okay, so if this is our maximum loan amount, we can go ahead and put that in as a present value. And once again, this is going to be 12 payments per year. All right. Then we say, okay, well, they're willing to give us a 20-year loan. All right. So based on that, what is going to be the maximum monthly payment based upon working it this way, kind of from the front end? Okay. $52,796.46 would be our maximum monthly maximum monthly payment
for that loan.
For this loan. It's two separate problems, but they're going to be kind of integrated in a second. All right? Multiplying that times 12 to get our annual debt service would be $633,557.51. Okay? Everybody still with me?
Yes.
Okay? Now, this is where then we begin to kind of integrate some of this. So what we're doing now what we have in our possession at this point is our debt service, $633,557.51. Everybody see that? Okay. Now, if the lender had set a debt service coverage requirement of 1.3, working at it from this angle, we now have the annual debt service of the $633,557.51, so we can simply multiply that by the 1.3, and that's going to give us $800 $23,624.76.
How do we come up with the 1.3 again?
The lender gives us that. The lender says we're, once again, maximum, or I'm sorry, minimum debt service coverage ratio is going to be 1.3.
Okay.
Okay, so now if we have those two numbers, if we want to, then we can see, okay, well, how much does that mean we have left over? 633, 557, 51. And so we have left over 190, 06725. But that's not inherently what we're interested in. We're interested in continuing to work backwards on this, okay? I'm sorry?
So you multiply the 1.3 to the numbers we do have.
Right. What you're going to see in almost all of this is how everything can be worked from top to bottom, can also be worked from bottom to top, okay? And depending on what you have available to you and what you're ultimately sort of searching for will sort of dictate which direction you take, all right? So in this particular case, what we're working back toward is what is the rental rate that we would ultimately need to charge on these units in order to satisfy that. Does that make sense? Okay, so previously, what did we use for our operating expense ratio? I'm just going to double check, make sure I don't want to screw it up. Yep, 30% of effective gross income, right here. All right, so the beauty of math is this number here, net operating income, basically represents 70% of EGI, whereas operating expenses represent 30% of EGI, and EGI represents 100% of EGI. Does everybody follow that?
Yes.
Simple math? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, so all we have to do is to take the 823,624.76 divided by 0.7, and that's going to give us our EGI, in this case of 1,176,606.80. Does everybody understand what I just did?
You know,
All I did was take the 823,624.76, which is our NOI, and divided that by 0.7, okay, which is what that represents of the EGI, and then that's going to give us our EGI, or effective gross income, of the 1,176,606.80. It's just very, very, very basic, you know, 5th grade math, okay? All you're doing is just simply saying, oh, hello, what just happened there? Okay. So all we, once again, have done is simply say, we got the 1,176,606.80. That represents the EGI. So we don't even really solve for the total operating income, although we can by just simply taking that minus that, and that's, so we can do that if we want to, minus 823,624.76. So our operating expenses are actually 352,982.04. Okay. Then we kind of go back up here to the other income, vacancy collection losses, and PGI. Okay. What was our other income number that we used for this property? 12,000. Okay, 12,000, is our, oops, no, 120. 12,000. Okay. Now, vacancy and collection losses,
Negative 60.
I'm sorry?
It was negative 60.
It was negative 60, but that, we can either say, okay, well, was that a fixed number or was it a percent? Well, in this case, it was a fixed number because we didn't really apply it as a percentage, so we'll just go ahead and make it the same. What the heck? 60,000. And then we just work backwards. So we take the 1,176,606.80,
1.2.
and we add in
60.
plus 60, and then minus 12, and that should get us to 224,606.80. So let's just double check. Minus 60 plus 12. Yep. Okay. All right. Now, with that number, once again, all we have done is work backwards. Okay. So now we have a situation where we know that we've got 100 units. Okay. So let's start with that. So that's going to give us $12,246.07 per year per unit. Does that make sense? Then we would divide that by 12. And then that is going to give us 1,020.51, which would be the rental per unit per month. So instead of, in the previous example, or we were getting what? $1,000 a month. Okay? So what the model is telling us is if we go into the market and we find a property and it's actually $10 million, and we work backwards, then the reality is we're going to have to charge at least $1,020 a month in rent in order to make the deal work. Does that make sense? Okay. That's why what I'm saying is we work it one way, then we work it from the bottom up. So top down and bottom up, or kind of front door, back door, whichever way you want to kind of think of it. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, let's take a break. All right, 5-minute break. Be back 10 till. So that's actually more like 7 minutes.
Quick question, why can't you just take 90%? Like, what makes that different? Why does it come up with a different?
I'll show you. This is taking just simply 90%. This is dividing it by 1.1. It's a question of where your point of basis is. In this case, what we're doing is we're in essence saying, all right, if this represents the whole, then the base amount needs to be 1.1 times less than that. In other words, it's not just a simple 90%. It's like, as you can see, it's like 90.9. If you simply take 100 divided by 1.1, it's not the same. It's because you're basically adding 10% to the 90.9 in order to get to 100. Like for example, let me show it another way.
How big is, like, you would just take
so like
10 for that
like for example, if you were to take 90 and then you say, okay, let me simply take 10% of that. Whoops. And that's going to be 9. And so whenever you add them together, then it's going to be just 99. So that's in essence kind of what's happening here is this is really what you're basing the percent off of, not really off of the 100. Because of the way in which we're working it. So it's not going to be a huge difference, but mathematically the correct way to do it is off of, you're simply saying that the 100 is our value, and then from that we're saying, okay, what in essence, with a 10% cushion between the annual debt service and the net operating income, what does that 10% cushion look like?
Good, Donegan.
Yep. That's where we're at.
Oh,
I didn't understand one thing, how you got the 823,624, the NOI. I know it's from the 1.3, but somehow I didn't get it. I know it's simple math, I just didn't see how you got that. I go, oh, okay, let me see.
Okay.
No, I know that, but, okay.
So, down here, so all I did here, we know that the lender requires a debt service coverage ratio of 1.3. We know we have calculated our maximum annual debt service based upon up here to be that.
I understand.
So all we're doing is we're basically then just solving for the unknown.
Yeah, I know that, but how did you solve it?
Okay, you're just going to take this times this gives you that.
Oh, that's all it is? Okay, my bad, that's easy.
Just get a reference it.
Yeah.
Because this is a formula, so then we took that formula. We knew the variables.
Yeah.
DCRs.
No, I know what he did. I understood everything except for that one part. I couldn't catch it fast enough.
That's everyone feels adjusted.
I'm pretty sure I know it.
And so he finished and then I started.
So you
Yeah.
have the same license sheet? Oh, you don't have to.
It's only if you want to sign it.
It's like kind of like an accreditation or something?
But since he has it configured, like, if we ever start anything, he can be the one to sign and seal.
Yeah, we can really talk. I'm not doing something together.
So you're getting a count. You already took it out.
So, but you're like, so much.
No, I like this. Yeah, but, yeah, I have a list of stuff. So,
Yeah, it's helpful. Really
I
cool.
think it's more, we understand it's really easy to like, really successful. Yeah, my background, it's not
I know.
what I'm used to. I mean, analytical part of it is fine,
Mhm.
but this is a big one.
Professor?
Yep.
Was it 30% EGI given?
Yes.
I just made it.
Okay, let's get the campers back in here. So, getting down to, in this case, our before tax cash flow number, whichever way that, you know, we've kind of chosen to get there, you know, front or back, what we want to do is we want to say, all right, in this particular instance, we bought this property for, let's say, we're going to do one payment per year. Well, sort of. I'm going to kind of take a few things here and there. All right. So let's say that we do buy this property for $10 million. Okay. And this is sort of, we're going to not take everything into consideration yet with regard to the loan. We're going to get there in a minute, but right now we're just going to sort of say, all right, before tax cash flow was $190,067.25 as a cash flow, and then our final, well, actually, let's do it this way. Since it's only going to be for, let's just do this for 1 year. So if we want to say, we could do this as, this is present value, this is our payment, and then ultimately we sell it for, let's say, $10 million, exactly what we have in it. And we held it for 1 year. Oops. One shift in, and calculate what is our return over the course of that year. Okay, so this would just be basically saying, okay, what do we pay for it? What do we have as an operating cash flow off the property on a before tax basis, and then we sell it for exactly what we pay for it. What is our rate of return off of this? And what you're going to see, 1.9006725. There's a reason why I carried it out that far. If you're going to notice, it's very similar to what the payment is. Because what we're basically saying is if we bought something for $10 million, we sell it for $10 million, and the only income that it's generating is this $190,000, what does that really represent on an annual basis? 1.9% return. Okay, does everybody see that? Okay, that is just really meant to kind of just illustrate. Okay, now, here's the thing.
Mine just got like an error when I tried to click it.
You didn't put one of them in as a, you didn't put that in as a negative. If you put it in as a positive, then it'll either give you no solution or error.
Okay, I'll try it.
Okay, all right, now, here's the thing. This is pretty much saying, all right, we're putting in $10 million of cash, which we're not, okay? We're going to be putting in equity, and so this is the amount of money that we have left over, obviously, after we've paid out debt service. So this really isn't an over-accurate representation of what the rate of return that we're really getting on the deal, okay? I'm doing this on purpose because I want to try to illustrate something. This may have been the cost of the deal. This may be what we sold the deal for. And this is the operating income after we subtracted out debt service. But what we really got to do is say, well, what is our return on our money? Like the real hard currency that we're putting into this deal. All right? What are we actually putting into the deal? If we go back up here, we're putting in $8 million, or sorry, we're we're borrowing 8 million, so we're putting in 2 million. Yes? So the equity that we're really putting in this deal is not 10 million, it's 2 million. And so the return that we're getting of this 190,067.25 as the payment amount. And then if we end up selling it at the end of the year, and now for simplistic purposes, let's just say it's an interest-only loan, which it's not, but let's just say that it is for simplicity's sake, then whenever we pay off the loan of $8 million, we're going to get back 2 million, yes? Which would be then our future value, okay? Now, if we solve again, what you're going to find, our rate of return, okay? We end up with 9.503, blah, 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 on out. Okay. All right, so that's a pretty big difference, yes? It's like, you know, obviously, like probably 4 times as much or so. We're getting basically 2% here, and you're getting, you know, 9.5%, so about 4 times or so as much. So, but this is a little bit more accurate. Still not fully accurate, but still it's closer to the reality of what is actually transpiring here, because we put in $2 million into the deal, yes? We borrowed $8 million, okay? So at the end of the year, we still have to pay back that $8 million that we borrowed out of the $10 million proceeds, yes? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, meaning that we get to keep out of those proceeds roughly $2 million. So if that's what we put in, that's what we get out, that is the return that we have over the course of the year, and that means we made about 9.5% on our investment. Does that make sense, yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay, now to be more accurate, what we would need to do is we would need to say, okay, over the course of that year, we did pay down some of the mortgage, did we not? Okay, in other words, we made payments, and of those payments, part of those payments were interest, part of those payments were principal, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, I don't need to get into this right now, but I'm going to do one more little step, and trust me, we're going to get even more advanced into this as we go on, but I'm just trying to kind of walk you through kind of logically how this sort of fits together. Yep.
I thought it was an interest on the loan.
That's what I said. I mean, that assumption just for that example, okay? Now, assuming it's not an interest-only loan, and it's actually what it was, it is an actual normal mortgage, then what we've got to do is we've got to go back here where we have all the loan information, and we're going to do this super quick right now. We're going to go in, okay, so let me make sure that I'm being very, very, very clear. I'm going to do it really quick, get the answer, and then ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to come back to this next week in a different way. But I just kind of want to work through the example just to show you what it basically boils down to. Okay? Make sense? All right. So if I go back to this original loan, the $8 million. All right. And I put in all the information as is. $8 million, 5% interest rate, 20-year term, solve for the payment, okay, and I get that number. All right. Now the next steps, as I said, I'm going to go into much more detail later, like next week. But if I follow from that, and I use a function on the calculator, it's called the amortization function. All right, which will allow me to determine how much principal and how much interest that I actually paid in that year. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 1 input 12, which is going to give me the information from month 1 through month 12. Shift, amortization, and then equal equal, is gonna give me the principal, interest, and balance. All right, so, okay, so our principal, 238,984.91. Our interest, 394,572.60. Our balance, 7,761,015.09. Okay, so over just the first year of that loan, which is our holding period, just for 1 year, okay, what we're saying is that we paid down $238,000 of principal. In other words, the balance of the loan decreased by that amount, which can be then reflected in this number here. If you take the 8 million minus 238, you get the 7.761, okay? And then what's left over was the amount of interest that we paid in that first year, okay? Pretty disgusting that you're actually paying, once again, more in interest than you are in actual principal, okay? Now, what we're gonna do, as I said, I'm working through this one kind of fast, only to just illustrate a more accurate way of getting at some of the numbers that we're dealing with down here. All right, so if we sort of said up front, back to 1 payment per year, clear everything out, okay, up front nothing changes. We put in $2 million of our money as the present value, yes? Okay, and we received 190,06725 as the payment amount for that year. Yes? And it was for 1 year. So, now we've got to figure out what is the dollar amount we want to put in to the future value in order to solve for our rate of return. There's a method to my madness on this. Now here's what you need to think about, okay? The original price of the property was $10 million, okay? Now, what we've got to do is we've got to say, all right, the balance on the loan was $7,761,000. 01509. That's balance end of year 1. All right, so let's take that. And we end up with 2,238,984.91. So that is the number that we're really going to get back at the end of the year when we resell this on a before-tax basis. You notice I keep throwing in those little caveats now on a before-tax basis because obviously at some point we're going to deal with after-tax issues. Okay, but right now, when I'm just on a before-tax basis, 2,238,984.91. Now, why is that? Why is this number $238,000 or $238,984? Why is it that much more than the $2 million? Because that was the principal that we paid off on the loan over the course of that year. Does everybody remember that number? When we put principal, interest, balance, that was the amount that we've paid off. So in other words, that money for the principal came out of our operating cash flow because we paid our debt service, yes? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in other words, now when we calculate our rate of return, because of what is called equity buildup, we're getting even a bigger rate of return than we were getting previously. Okay, so let's see what we get. Now make sure that you got calculators set back on 1 payment per year. You gotta admit, that's even better. Okay? Because now we're actually taking into consideration the fact that we've already paid down $238,000 worth of the loan over the course of that first year. So therefore, that inflates our return that much more because we're getting that money back at the time of the sale. Okay? Everybody cool? All right. Cool.
Could you just go up real quick?
So basically, buying a piece of real estate for that much, selling it for the same price, good deal.
Because you pay down part of the loan.
Yeah, which is bizarre though. Like, you know, you wouldn't think that, you know, you sell it and for the same price and then you make 21% return.
Because it was fast.
Well, yeah, because it was fast, but also the fact that, now, but see, on an after-tax basis, not going to be so good because you're going to pay a massive tax on that short-term hold.
You could roll it though.
What? Well, no, because you've held it less than 2 years. Okay, different tax structure. You know, so you, basically that income gets taxed as ordinary income as opposed to capital gains income. And so your ordinary income tax rate may be, let's say, 30-something%, whereas capital gain might only be, you know, 15 or 20%. Okay, but the whole that's the investments class. So we'll wait until we get to that point. Okay. Yep.
I was gonna say, but if you did it as a corporation, you could keep the money and retain earnings.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah.
But once again, that's all gets into, once again, kind of all of our tax implications. Okay, all I really want to do here is just illustrate, kind of walk yourself through a simple problem, begin to make the problem a bit more complex, add in a couple of extra little features, because this is usually the big surprise. It's like, oh wow, I didn't really think about that equity buildup and how much that is really going to contribute to the overall return that I get off of this property. Okay? All right, moving forward. Let's see, where are we here? Ooh. Modified internal rate of return. Just out of curiosity, has anybody ever heard of modified internal rate of return? Murph? Okay, one person. Okay. No one else. Okay, so is it Kenny? Is that right?
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay. So what have you heard about modified internal rate of return? Anything, or you just heard of it?
Isn't that when you have irregular income, negative, positive,
Yes.
negative?
That is, how do you deal with a situation of where you've got cash flows that are both positive and negative after your initial sort of purchase? Okay? Because everything up to now that we have done has been, okay, negative cash flow times 0, and then positive, 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 calculate a rate of return. Yes? But what if you have a situation of where you've got cash outflow, in other words, one negative, and then positive, negative, positive, negative, negative, positive, negative. How do you deal with basically those cash flows? You say, well, I don't know. Well, the problem is how you look at those negative, in other words, where does the money come from to deal with those negative cash flows? So think about this for a second. You own a property, you know, small rental property, big rental property, doesn't really matter, the concept is the same. So you operate that property the first year, makes a ton of money. But then all of a sudden you've got to spend a bunch of money on unexpected things during the second year, okay? You've got to do some capital improvements, you've got to do, you know, some maintenance you weren't expecting, you've got to, you know, who knows, pay attorney fees, you know, whatever it is. So all of a sudden that second year, you've got a negative cash flow. Where does the money come from to pay for that negative cash flow? Well, in our little world, we've got to assume that money's coming from the property. So what you could make the assumption is, okay, that previous year where you made a lot of money, you're going to use some of that money to pay basically the deficit for the following year. Does Does that make sense? But how do we account for that? Okay, so what I have chosen to do is I created a little spreadsheet, okay, to kind of help illustrate the concept. All right? And then we'll do it on the calculator. All right, so if you put in this series of cash flows, ignore column C and D for the moment. Just focus, put these in your calculator, one payment per year. Put in -50 as your cash outflow initially. Put in +10 for year one. Put in -5,000 for year two. And then +85,000 for year three. And then solve for internal rate of return. And you should get the 23.45. Okay, so just double check, make sure. You need to do that because you're going to have to do a little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay. Once again, I'll write it out up here on the screen. Okay.
Yep.
I'm just going to double check it myself. Okay, so 23.45%. Okay, everybody matches with that, yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay. So part of what we're, in this, it's where we're trying to be as precise as we possibly can be, okay? And so we have to figure out, once again, where does this money come from, okay? Because if the property is not generating enough income to support itself that year, we've got to draw that money from somewhere else, yes? Okay? And so one of the ways that you can deal with this is through something called the modified internal rate of return. Now there's a function in Excel equal MIRR, okay? And what it does, we click on this just to sort of show you. The internal rate of return function, you see all that is just internal rate of return and then basically that reference of those cells, okay? And then you come down here, oops, come down here to the modified internal rate of return, and what it's got that it's looking at the same group of values, but then it's using two different things, a financing rate and a reinvesting rate. In this case, we're making them the same, 5% and 5%. Now what that means is as follows, that in essence what's happening is you're taking all the negative stuff, like the 5,000, and you're pushing it back to time period 0. And you're discounting it at 5% to get there. So if we do that, and we take this 5,000 and we discount it at 5% for 2 years, that means it's only worth $4,500 up front. okay? And so what we would do is sort of say, okay, take the 50,000, take that dollar amount, that's the dollar amount we would in essence need at time period 0 in order to fund that, assuming that the 5% discount. But then we also kind of say, well, what about the positive dollar amounts that we receive? Are we going to be able to reinvest those positive amounts into some sort of an account, kind of moving forward in time? So we have a kind of reinvestment rate of where we take that $10,000, we move it forward, basically 2 periods, so it's now worth $11,000. So what that means is we would take that, add it to that, and that would be our total sort of cash inflow, that would be our total cash outflow. And then now that we have removed kind of the effect, if you will, of the financing rate and the reinvestment rate, then we simply put this in as our series of cash flows. This is our initial expenditure. So for time period 1, we put a 0. For time period 2, we put a 0. And then put 96,000 as the rate for the dollar amount for year 3. Solve for our normal internal rate of return, which is really our modified internal rate of return. Okay, hold the phone. Okay, so you see that this 20.75 down here was calculated using the modified internal rate of return function, whereas this is just simply using the internal rate of return function on those 2 numbers. Okay, so what we're saying, this is the important part, is that the impact of having that sort of negative cash expenditure occurring here is hurting us a little bit with regard to our overall return. So it's, well, we still have a good return, 20-something% is still good. The effect of it is it's really pushing it down a little bit. So now this is a simple example. We go and we want to make it much more complicated and have a lot more negatives, a lot more years, and so forth. And that, impact is going to be potentially that much more pronounced in terms of the difference between using the traditional internal rate of return and the modified internal rate of return. All the modified internal rate of return is trying to do, simply put, is try to get a more accurate representation of what the true return is whenever you have those irregular cash flows or negative cash flows, and the impact that those have on your return calculations. That's all it's trying to do, okay? Now, to do this on, okay, Justin, let me take your question first and then I'll talk about how to do it on the calculator.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm just trying to understand. So essentially you're saying that, okay, you're buying a property for $50,000, okay? I'm just kind of confused on how it goes from 10 to 5 and then why conceptually why it's going to be a different percentage of return, because you're putting the money on beforehand?
Well, you got to, once again, it all comes back to what you're doing with your money, okay? Are you putting the money in a mattress? Are you putting it in a bank? Are you, spending it on something else? And all of that factors into, because what's it said, the simplest way to think about this, that probably a lot of people would just simply do, is to say, okay, I made $50,000 or I made $10,000 in that first year. I've got that sitting in my bank.
Okay.
So next year, whenever I have a $5,000 loss, I just use $5,000 of that money to pay off that loss, meaning now I've got $5,000 sitting in my bank.
Sure.
You follow?
Yeah.
But the issue is it's sometimes not just that simple, because it's a question of, you may not have that $10,000 sitting in a bank account. You may have spent that money already. You may have had to pay it out to investors. So the question is, how do you make an adjustment for that? And that's where basically the issue of the sort of the financing rate and the reinvestment rate of basically discounting it back to time period 0 and then compounding forward all of the income into the future to try to get a more accurate representation of what the return calculation actually is. Okay? Now, in some instances, here's what's going to happen. And the reason I teach this is because in many cases, blindly, many people just are, on the calculator, they don't really think about the implication of this. And there are plenty of scenarios that I could come up with that are legitimate scenarios, especially where you have multiple negative cash outflows that you punch in the calculator, you're going to get no solution. The calculator simply will not give you a solution because it's saying, I can't calculate, or it will give you a solution that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Okay? One little cash outflow here, it makes a little bit of a difference between, here and here. But imagine if, once again, we stretch this out to 10 years or whatever of, once again, positive and negative cash flows, it begins to be much more complicated. So the most direct and hopefully accurate solution is to be consistent with how we treat those expenditures in terms of discounting them back to the initial cash outflow and then compounding forward.
And and the finance rate and the reinvestment rate, we just chose 5% for this problem.
Right.
So
basically we're saying that both of them are the same.
Okay.
But our cost of money is 5%, but also if we were to reinvest any income, what is that income going to grow at?
5%.
Right.
Gotcha.
They could be different rates. That you could, potentially have this at, well, just sort of.
So if the finance rate's 5%, then.
Yeah, so like, for example, let's just say we bump this up to 15%, okay? And then now keep in mind, nothing over here in C and D are going to change because those are hard-coded calculations because so we can, just try tinkering around. If we put both of them as 0, then we know 19.98, meaning we make no adjustments whatsoever to the cash flow. We simply just take it all the way back, take it all the way forward, but make no adjustment for refinancing or for financing. Okay. But like I said, ignore these over here because those are, like I said, hard-coded. I didn't take the time to go ahead and put them calibrated with the financing.
So the $5,000 is being multiplied by the 5%, then being subtracted to get that 4,000.
Yeah, so all I did here to get this was to take, in essence, the 5%. In this case, it would be the financing rate, which to be probably more dynamic, I should just go ahead and put the cell reference of B8 in there. All right, and then now. What I can do is if I were to go here and I were to put in 15%, it makes the adjustment.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Or, 0. And then if I were to do the same thing down here, change this to B9, all right, and I were to change that to 0, okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the finance rate deals with all of the expenditures or the negative cash flows that you're discounting back to the present. The reinvestment rate is the compounding rate to take everything that's positive forward. So hypothetically, let's just say that we made this, 5%, but yet our reinvestment rate for 15%,
Okay. So essentially what you're saying is that if you know you're going to lose 5,000 on year 2, you're going to take it out you're going to add it into the negative cash flow, add the percentage of investment.
Okay. This is all to just accurately calculate a rate of return. That's all it is.
Okay.
It's not the accounting treatment of it. It's simply how would you try to accurately calculate a rate of return.
Okay.
Okay. It's not necessarily cash in, cash out. It's more of how do you calculate the rate of return?
Okay.
Okay, everybody good? All right.
That being said, it does kind of show you how to deal with a bad year. Like you.
That's what it's meant to, just for the purposes of calculating the rate of return. Okay. All right. Now let's kind of try to show you, in essence, what is happening. All right. So what we're really doing in this particular example is we're taking that 5,000 negative, and we're making, and this is going to clear everything out so I don't get confused. We're making that, in essence, a future value because it's occurring here in year 2. Okay. It's being discounted back 2 periods at a 5% finance rate or discount rate, and so we're solving for what is its present value. Okay. And so what you get is the 45, 35, 15. Okay, and you see that number with that 5% finance rate matches up to this. Yes? Okay, so let's just for fun, let's say that we change that financing rate to 7%. Okay, well, let's do it over here. 7%. Okay, so we should match. Yes? Okay, does everybody see the connection? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, now, basically we're going to do the same thing on the 10,000 cash flow in terms of compounding it forward. So clear everything out. Take 10,000 as our present value, compound it forward 2 periods from basically year 1 to year 3, compounding forward 2 periods at the 5% reinvestment rate. That's what the future value is on it. We get 11,025. Okay, once again, that corresponds to this. Okay, now once again, if we raise that, I don't know, let's say 8%. The same thing here. Should get 11,664. Okay? All right, are we all good?
I'm getting negative.
Well, yeah, it'll be negative, but you just realize that it's a positive number.
I just scroll to the top of the.
Okay, so now what you've got to do, okay, your question over there somewhere?
Just in your life, what would the reinvestment rate represent?
The reinvestment rate is kind of like your opportunity cost. You know, what other alternative opportunities do you have, and what are those basically opportunities yielding? But in other words, it's basically saying, where are you going to take your excess proceeds? Where are you going to park them? If you park them in just your mattress, it's going to be a 0% reinvestment rate. Okay, because there's no money being earned off of that. If you park it in a savings account, just for safekeeping, it might be 2%. But if you're going to take that money and immediately plow it into a brand new investment that's earning, 12, 15%, then that reinvestment rate is going to be 12, 15%. Does that make sense? Okay. It's just a question of where you're putting the money, the excess funds.
You're reinvesting it right back into the same company that went negative that year. Is there a percent?
Well, then it's pretty much going to be the same as the finance rate. It's going to be that's why that in many instances may be the same. 5% on the front end, 5% on the back end. Okay. All right. Now, the only thing then that you have to do in terms of sort of solving, let me go back to these 5% here for a second, is if I were to ask you, on this original scenario, calculate the modified internal rate of return on those cash flows, then all you're going to be doing is making these two adjustments to get the final cash flow number that you would then put in and then solve and get the answer. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, very simple. All right.
It's all gonna be on one payment per year.
Right.
Sorry, and again, in real life scenario, you would would that percentage take into consideration any inflation? If you're
Yes.
bringing it back?
Yes. Absolutely. Okay. All right.
And as a check, would the sum of column 1 equal the sum of column B?
Okay, one more time. With the sum of what?
You're distributing the money, so the total sum would equal on both sides, just as a check.
Yeah, in terms of well, no, because this has been adjusted by time value of money, so it's not going to be the same exact dollar amount. So in other words, here you've got 85 plus 10, which would be 95,000. Here you get actually 96,000 because of you're growing that 10,000 at 5% a year for 2 years.
Gotcha.
And then the opposite is occurring to the 5,000. You're discounting it for 2 years at 5%. So instead of it being worth 5,000, it's only worth 4,500 at time period 0. Okay. All right. Moving forward. Okay. All right, it is time for financial leverage. I didn't hear any yoo-hoos. Okay. Financial leverage. Probably one of the most important things to understand about investing in real estate is the use of financial leverage, or in other words, the use of other people's money. Okay? And by other people's money, that can be lenders using their money to leverage your investment. It could also be friends and family or just other investors off the street. But the idea behind financial leverage is that for the most part, in most contexts, it's using debt to ultimately inflate your overall rate of return on your equity investment. Now, you can have both what is referred to as positive financial leverage, which means it's a good thing, and it helps you tremendously. But on the flip side, if the project doesn't do so well, you can end up with negative financial leverage, meaning you lose a lot. Okay? Now, probably one of the simplest examples to start off with, well, first of all, to help understand, okay, all of you remember, I would hope, like your basic sort of physics, and they talked about levers and fulcrums and stuff like that. Is that, I mean, of course the engineer, yes, nodding his head instantly, yay, okay. But everybody else, I mean, what about my architect over here? Levers, okay, fulcrums, okay. So for the rest of you, just think of the grade school teeter-totter, okay? You know, where you've got, you know, basically the situation of where you've got this, you know, fulcrum here, and then you've got basically a piece of wood or whatever laid on top of that, and then you've got, you know, the skinny little kid that I was whenever I was growing up, unlike the big fat kid that I am now. And then over here, you know, basically if you've also got another, you know, sort of skinny kid on the other side, and for the most part, assuming this is equal distance on then basically everybody's going to be kind of, you know, just sort of sitting there, you know, equal weight, equal distribution, you know, in terms of what they can kind of, you know, without the force of moving it up and down, it just sort of stays, you know, flat. But if all of a sudden, you know, we kind of change things a little bit, and, you know, you've got the situation, you're saying, well, how does this, you're going to see the reason here in a minute. So if you've got a situation of where you've got now the big kid down here, all right, on this end, then, you know, they're easily able to lift the little kid down here on the other end, okay? But you could also have the situation of where you could lever things, and you could have, in essence, the big kid, the little kid down here, and in essence, well, could end up lifting very easily, putting down the weight, could end up lifting the big kid. Does that make sense? In other words, that would be leverage. Now, you're saying, how does this relate to finance? Okay, well, how it relates to finance is basically, it's a continuum. Over here is 0% debt. Over here is 100% debt. All right? And so you think about the fulcrum, and in essence, depending on where it's placed, is how highly levered you are, or how much leverage that you have to be able to lift something, okay? And in this case, what we're lifting is the financial weight of a property, okay? So think about it from this perspective. All right, let's say, for simplicity's sake, you have $100,000 of cash equity that you received in an inheritance, salary, doesn't really matter, but it's your money, you got it in a suitcase that you can take with you anywhere you need to go, all right? So what you could do is you could take that $100,000 of cash equity, you go find a house, all right? And that house, let's say is $100,000. Purchase price for the house. And the house is throwing off, after taxes, let's say $10,000 a year of income. All right? And so that would represent basically $10,000 a year of income divided by the amount of money you paid on the property. That is a 10% rate of return. Yes? Everybody understands that? Yes or no? Okay? All equity deal, all cash deal. But let's say that, as we were sort of talking about earlier, we could use debt. Okay? And let's say that we have a lender that's willing to give us an 80% loan-to-value ratio. All right? So what does that mean? Well, that means that we've got to put in 20% of the purchase price and we borrow 80%. All right? So in this case, now that same $100,000, what can we do? We can actually buy 5 houses. Does everybody follow that logic? Because now you've got house number 1, it's going to have 20,000 equity, 80,000 debt. House number 2, same thing. House number 3, same thing. House number 4, same thing. And house number 5, same thing. So if that's the case, you add up all of your equity and it's still your original $100,000 investment. Yes? Does everybody follow that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. But then how much debt do we have?
400,000.
Okay. All right. Everybody with me? Okay. Now, let's say that each of these houses does the same performance. It pays off $10,000 a year. In other words, in you know, the net operating income is $10,000 per house. Okay, but what are we introduced into this situation?
Got to pay down the interest.
We got to pay down the debt. Okay, now this is where it becomes mission critical to understand. Okay, what is our cost of debt? Well, let's say that our cost of debt is 5%. Okay, keep things simple. All right, if our cost of debt is 5%, 5% of, in this case, well, 80,000 is going to be the debt amount per house. That is 4,000 bucks. So our annual debt service, because we're going to make the assumption it's an interest-only loan for simplicity, okay, we can complicate it up later, all right? So that means our before-tax cash flow is going to be $6,000, yes? Is right with me on this, yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay, now, that $6,000, what was our equity investment in the property?
20,000.
%30 sort of equity rate of return, or return on equity, you know, the way to actually probably better to call it that. Okay, does everybody understand that, yes or no? Now, in terms,
Well, that's for just one.
I know, it's just for one house,
Okay,
but
no,
it's
I
gonna,
just
it's
wanna
gonna be
make
the same for,
Yeah.
for each of the houses,
Got
but here's also the thing to consider. You're getting that before tax cash flow, 6,000 times 5 houses, or $30,000 of raw cash income, okay? Yes? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, now, okay, so if that's a before tax cash flow, that's the money we're getting per house, 6 times 5, or 6,000 times 5 is $30,000, all right? Now, but here's the thing, okay? If we had just bought the one house with $100,000 cash, we would only be getting $10,000. So we're getting literally 3 times as much total cash, or 3 times the return. Instead of getting a 10% return, unleveraged, we're getting a 30% return, leveraged. Okay, Chase?
Okay, so I think I'm just like piecing it together, but 10,000 a year on the upside is like basically an opportunity cost of if you leverage you can get 5 houses. If you didn't, you could just buy one at 100,000 for 10,000.
Correct.
Okay, and so now you're getting, like you said, $6,000 of before tax
house.
cash flow, yeah, times 5. Okay, understood.
Okay, so this is the excitement of real estate, okay? Because this is giving you control. That same $100,000 that was only allowing you to control one property, one house, now through the miracle of financing and debt, you're now controlling 5 houses or $500,000 worth of property. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. But this is the positive side of financial leverage. The negative side of financial leverage is what happens if instead of getting that $10,000 a year of income, that for whatever reason the market dramatically shifts and maybe you only get $3,000 a year of income. Okay? Everybody follow? Okay, well let's just kind of follow that through down here. Oops, yellow. Well, what that means is now instead of $10,000 of income per house, you're only getting $3,000. That means that now your before tax cash flow is a negative $1,000 divided by the $20,000 that you still have invested. So you end up with a negative 0.05 or negative 5% rate of return, or in other words, you are losing, in this case, $1,000 per house per year, or you're losing $5,000. Does that make sense? Or 5%.
And the value of the property too is now,
Potentially less.
it could be underwater too.
Right. Okay? Does that make sense? Yep. Yep.
Yeah, would that potential loss be prevented by the debt service coverage ratio?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, yes, because the lender hopefully has forced you to set aside enough money where that would not happen. But if something just catastrophic happened, I mean, you think of all kinds of just crazy, ridiculous scenarios. Like, for example, let's say that you didn't have proper insurance on the property, and the property got damaged to where it's no longer able to be occupied without serious renovations or whatever. Well, you're screwed. You know, or you know, some sort of environmental contaminant, you know, gets released on the property. Well, once again, not, you know, habitable and maybe not covered by insurance, and you know, so there's a lot of weird things that can happen. But it also just may just be the market. That once again, this property is no longer a viable, interesting, you know, sort of investment because maybe it's in the wrong area. You know, maybe, you know, in terms of crime and perception of risk and all that sort of thing, you know, changes the viability of it. Okay? All right, any other questions, observations? So here's the thing. If you can master this particular element, this is how you build a real estate empire, okay? Is off of that sort of financial leverage of basically taking the proceeds that you make from one property, plowing them into another property, plowing them into another property, plowing them into another property over and over again until ultimately all of the debt has been, you know, paid off over maybe a 15, 20, you know, year period, and then it all becomes mailbox money, you know, in the sense that all you're doing is just collecting the revenue, you know, off of the property free and clear. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, yep.
Essentially, to pull out the equity from the prior home, you have to do a cash out refi to do.
Yeah, so in terms of pulling out the equity, then yeah, you might have to get some sort of a line of credit against the equity of that property, or it could be that whenever you go to refinance the property, maybe at some future date, like you do a 5-year balloon note with a commercial property, and at the end of that 5 years, you get the property revalued, you pull out the equity, you get a new loan, and then ultimately take that equity, then, as I said, plow it into another property. Or you take, you know, once again, the gains from, if you sell the property, take the gains from the sale, plow it into another property to, you know, keep expanding. It's going to be a mixture of using operating income to plow into another property. Like, for example, one of the first properties I did, commercial properties, you know, I bought this 2-story building in Texas. It was about 6,000 square feet. I paid like $100,000 for the building, put, you know, probably another $100,000 of renovations into the building. Ultimately sold it for about $350,000, you know, but was able to live in it for a period of time and also rent out, you know, the space for several years. And it was a really cool building. I mean, it was originally a saloon and a whorehouse, you know, built in the 1890s.
Originally?
Right next to the railroad tracks. You know, fascinating building. But anyway, the point being, it actually still has the word saloon on the back of it. But so basically, the point of that was, in that particular instance, yeah, okay, I bought it for 100, I put 100 in it, sold it for like 350, but had that operating income for like the 6-7 years, I guess I owned it, and but then took the proceeds where I sold that, and then started plowing it into subsequent properties. You know, end up buying then a portfolio of like 7 or 8 more commercial properties that use the proceeds from that sale. Then, you know, anyway, that's the way that it works. Okay, and then end up selling all those off over time. But except so anyway, any questions about this? Yep.
Instead of doing mailbox money, wouldn't you rather just keep leveraging out?
It's a question of whether you want to keep managing. Yeah, I'll give you a quick case study of my best friend in Texas. He and I partnered on a couple of these deals, and he bought even more than I did. He held on to pretty much everything, whereas I cashed out many years ago, but he continued to hold on to these things until the mortgages matured 15 years later. And now, you know, he is sitting on the mailbox money. I mean, and so like every single month, you know, it's like $50,000 of just mailbox money, of not having to lift a finger, you know, because all these mortgages are paid off. And so, you know, it's a simple life, you know, and he chooses then to, you know, all he has to do is basically keep the properties maintained and occupied, but, you know, there's no debt.
Would you have, going back, rather do that, or would you rather?
See, that's an excellent question, and for me personally, I absolutely, positively hate property management. Okay?
Even if it's like that.
Because I'm not the social guy that likes dealing with tenants. I should have hired somebody to effectively done that, but I'm not a people person, you know. I don't like dealing with tenants. You know, somebody calls me up in the middle of the night and says, hey, you know, I've got a leaky roof or whatever. I say, well, you know, call me back in the morning, maybe we'll, you know, deal with it. You know, I'm not the guy that's going to respond well.
Well, yeah, well, you could just hire that out.
I know, but it's easier said than done sometimes because, you know, you just kind of, I guess part of it is, you know, some things you internalize and keep you awake at night, and that sort of stuff would keep me awake at night. It would, because I mean, constantly thinking, okay, well, how much damage is being done to the building, you know, while the rain's pouring in, you know, and just start obsessing about that. But this is a more personal side of the process. But like my business partner, my best friend who I was talking about, he also probably internalizes about that. He can't sleep at night. He has to take Ambien every single night to sleep, you know, because he's constantly obsessing about those operational sort of details. Okay, that gets well beyond the scope of the finance piece of this, but it you know, in terms of you know, everybody has to have the personality that fits, I think, you know, what it is that you're doing. I very quickly understood the piece that I enjoyed was the entrepreneurial side of finding the property, renovating the property, getting the property initially occupied, and then figuring out a way to exit relatively quick. Okay?
So you'd rather do that over and over and over instead of trying to generate something to a portfolio?
Because that's more fun for me. And that's less stressful. It's stressful, but it's fun stressful, as opposed to the stress of owning and just dealing with the day-to-day property management stuff. Okay, anyway, I've diverged way too much on that. Okay, moving back. All right, so, but you get the general idea of how this works, yes? The whole leverage thing, all right? Now, whew, almost there. Okay. So, one of the things that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time on, and we did one little calculation today, but I said I was going to come back to it, which I am, is now to figure out what the outstanding balance is on a mortgage. All right? And show you how to do that. So, first of all, let's say that we've got 12 payments per year. All right? Give me a dollar amount for our mortgage. 150,000? 750,000. Okay. 750,000 is going to be our mortgage. The outstanding balance of the mortgage. Okay. What's our interest rate on this mortgage going to be?
3.75.
3.75. Okay. How many years for an amortization period on the mortgage?
30.
Okay, 30-year amortization. Okay. So, all right, those are the key pieces of information that, you know, obviously you're going to have to probably provide. Then, we're going to simply calculate what is the monthly payment. Okay. Okay. 34, 73, 37. Yes? Okay. Now, some of you have heard me say, and I said on this one, 30-year amortization. Period. But just because it's a 30-year amortization does not mean inherently that the term is for the full 30 years. Most commercial loans will have a 5-year balloon note. What that means is at the end of 5 years, on most commercial properties, not residential, commercial, you have to refinance or sell the property, or pretty much your two primary choices, okay? So what that means at the end of 5 years, we need to know how much we have left that we have to pay off or refinance, okay? And this is going to get into part of what you were talking about in terms of cashing out and so forth, so on. We'll talk a little bit about that. All right. So, and we're going to get into a deeper explanation of some of this a little bit later, but for now, for today, what you're going to do, much like we did a little bit earlier, one input, in this case 60, and I'll explain this here in a second, shift, amortize, equal, equal, equal. All right, so right now, just push the buttons and I'm going to explain in a minute. And the amortization key is underneath the future value key. That's our principal. Equal again. 133, 981, 90 is our interest, and our balance, 675, 579, 88. All right. So what is happening here is as follows. Okay. So we put in all the loan information, once again, present value, interest rate, term, solve for payment. That gives us our monthly payment. Okay, everybody's good with that. Now, the new piece is what we're doing is think of the calculator to a certain extent, it's almost like it's a database, and we're trying to extract information from that database. And in this case, what we're doing is we're saying to the calculator, give me the information on this loan for period number 1, or month number 1 in this case, through, that's what the input here does, give me the information from period number 1 through period number 60, or month 60, okay? So that's going to give us 5 years of monthly information about this loan, all right? And then we access the amortization function, which any of you that have ever written a loan, you typically get like this amortization schedule that sort of shows, here's how much you owe, and then each month, here's how much your principal, your interest, and your balance is. Next month, principal, interest, balance. Next month, principal, interest, balance, and so forth, so on, which we are going to construct later, not today, okay? So whenever you go through and you do this calculation, all it's saying is for that first 60 months, the cumulative amount that you have paid off, the principal of this loan, is $74,000. The amount of interest that you've paid over that first 5 years or 60 months is $133,000, and what you have left to pay after the first 5 years is the $675,000. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the simple thing I'm asking for, or going to be asking for in this particular question for the quiz, is simply, what is that balance? Okay. We're going to get into more detail later in terms of constructing an amortization schedule and how do we get to all of that and so forth, so on. Right now, focus on that, getting the balance. All right.
Pretty cool, honestly.
Okay. Now, got a couple more things and then we're ready for the quiz. All right, in your book, in the chapter on internal rate of return, let's see, get to it real quick.
got one more problem, probably.
How long do we have to do this?
30 minutes.
Okay. So specifically, in this edition of the books, page 382. Okay, this is where the print in this book's a little bit too small, so I'm going to put on the spectacles here for a second. All right, so page 382, take a look at the top figure for the Anderson before tax equity cash flow. And the information that you have been provided there, we'll just kind of write this down as they have it. You've got total cost of investment. We've got proceeds from mortgage. We've got cash flow from operations. We've got the interest payment. Cash flow from sale. We're going to explain all of these. I'm just going to write them down so we've got them here to work with. Repayment of mortgage. And total before tax equity cash flow. And then finally, net cash flow. All right. And so we've got like year one, I'm not going to write all these out, but we're going to write at least the first couple of years just so you get a sense of what's going on. And as I said, I'll kind of explain these. We've got 40 million. $30 million. Okay, in year two, drop down, we've got 3 million, and 2.1 million. All right, and so that gives us 10 million negative here. And that gives us 900,000 there. Okay. Then we kind of skip forward to year 5. Excuse me. Okay. Yes, we have 9 million, 2.1 million, 83 million. Okay. All right, so let's just kind of go through, walk through, and basically explain, in the event that you don't quite understand where these numbers. The reason I'm just using it from the book, just from the standpoint, that's the way they present it. Sometimes I do it a little bit differently, but I want to kind of illustrate what's really going on here. All right, so for this particular property, what we're saying is it cost us how much? 40 million. All right, and we got a $30 million mortgage, yes? So that means our equity was 10 million. Okay, everybody good with that? Yes or no?
Yeah.
What? What? Oh, sorry, yes, you're right. 0, 1. Sorry. Okay, so at time period 0, we end up having to be out of pocket $10 million. Yes? Okay, then in year 1, obviously, we sort of skip down. Now we're focused on the cash flow from operations, just like what we've been doing, talking about, okay, here's how much operating income that we have. And so this cash flow from operations would be, in essence, kind of the equivalent of, you know, pretty much net operating income, okay? And so this would be, once again, net operating income, and then from there, then what you're doing is you're subtracting on interest payment. Well, what they chose to do, in order to keep things simple, is they've made this an interest-only mortgage, so there's no amortization, no basically principal repayment, it's just an interest payment of $2.1 million for basically the 5-year holding period. So that means the net cash flow for or the before tax cash flow for that first year is $900,000. Somebody taking the $3 million, subtracting out the $2.1 million, giving you $900,000 of our before tax cash flow. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay. Then for years 2, 3, 4, you can obviously see what the numbers are there in the book. That's not the important part. The important thing now comes to year 5. In year 5, we now have $9 million of cash flow from the operations. Okay, so obviously the property's done very well for itself in terms of improving performance. Still have our interest payment of the $2.1 million, but now we go to sell the property. We're able to sell the property for substantially more than what we paid for it, primarily because we've done what? We've grown the income dramatically. Okay? Does everybody follow that? Yes or no? Okay, so we're able to now sell it for this price, and then we're able to cash out of our mortgage. And as I said, since it's an interest-only mortgage, we're simply basically saying we still owe $30 million 5 years later because it's been interest-only, no pay down of principal. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay? So, you take this, plus this, minus that. That gives us then $60 million as our total, basically, cash flow for year 5. Okay? Everybody cool? Yes, no? So one reason I sort of put this up here and sort of talking about this is this just takes and expands things just a little bit more, because what we've been pretty much doing is we've just been saying, okay, $10,000 investment, here are the cash flows, before tax cash flow, here's a reversion, calculate internal rate of return, right? So this is just sort of showing you kind of a little bit more detail of where those numbers are coming from. Okay? Make sense? Now, one other thing that they do is, much like I have done in a couple of instances, is they ask you to calculate the net cash flow. Now, this is not a time value of money calculation. This is simply outflows and inflows, and then seeing what the raw math comes back. In other words, how much more income have you received relative to how much you spent? So for this particular example, without writing all the numbers up there, all you're doing is you're starting out and you're taking the $900,000 for the year 1 before tax equity, adding that to $2.9 million in year 2, adding that to $4.4 million, adding that to $6.65 million, and then adding that to the $60,354,545, and then subtracting out $10 million initial purchase, and that's where that $65,204,545 comes from. Does that make sense? So all that's really telling you is you're making $64 million in raw cash increments off of that property. Okay? Without doing any sort of time value of money adjustments. Okay? Is everybody good with that? Take a deep breath. We have covered everything that's on the quiz today. Okay? So now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, come back, I'm going to talk about a couple more things, and then we'll start the quiz probably not too far after that. Okay? So I'll give you a little more time today than I did previously, so you'll, anyway, go take a 5-minute break. And then if you have any on your question sheet back from last week, I've got those, or your answer sheet, I'm sorry. And then Brian, let's see, Laurel, Kenny, and Jose. I've still got your question sheets up here.
So each class gets recorded and that's put up on the website.
Right.
That we sent out.
Okay. Okay. Okay, that's the reason why. Except for 1 payment per year. I just saw you clear it and set the form plan per year.
Alright, I need that.
So once again, 12 shift, and then payments per year. That's not critical. Should work. Try it again. Still not coming up? Okay, let me watch what you do. Moving up. Nope, that's what you're wrong. You're putting 30 in, not 30 shift in. You gotta put 30 shift in because it's 360 months. Okay, now solve it. There you go.
Time value every month.
See, matching up.
Okay. So then, input.
One input. One. Yep. Input. 60. Shift. Advertise. Equal. There you go. Okay. Equal again. There you go. Equal again. Right there.